Imagine being betrayed by your own brothers, sold into slavery, and falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit. This was the life of Joseph, Jacob's beloved son. From the depths of despair, imprisoned and humiliated, Joseph's remarkable journey led him to become the most powerful man in Egypt, next to Pharaoh himself. How could someone so rejected rise to such glory? The story of Joseph is one of the most captivating and powerful narratives in the Bible. Known as Jacob's beloved son, Joseph's life takes him from the heights of favor within his family to the depths of slavery, only to rise again to the pinnacle of power in a foreign land. Betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned, Joseph's journey is marked by divine providence, integrity, and remarkable resilience. But his story is more than just a tale of personal triumph. It's a profound testament to God's ability to use even the most dire circumstances for a greater purpose. Joseph's transformation from rejected slave to exalted ruler reveals God's hand at work in ways that continue to inspire believers today. In this video, we'll dive deep into the extraordinary life of Joseph, exploring the incredible lessons of faith, forgiveness, and divine intervention that his story offers. Whether you're familiar with the narrative or hearing it for the first time, Joseph's life holds valuable insights that can transform how we approach our own challenges. Joseph, the beloved son, sold into slavery by his brothers. Joseph, the son of Jacob and Rachel, lived in the land of Canaan with 10 half-brothers, a biological brother, and at least one half-sister. Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, his first son through his favored wife, Rachel. Joseph was the beloved son of Jacob, the firstborn of his favored wife, Rachel. Jacob's favoritism toward Joseph was evident, particularly when he gifted Joseph a richly ornamented robe, often referred to as the coat of many colors, Genesis 37:3. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him, Genesis 37:3. This coat became a symbol of Jacob's preferential love for Joseph, but it also became a point of deep resentment among his older brothers. Joseph's brothers knew that their father loved Joseph more than they did, which led them to hate him, Genesis 37:4. They were filled with jealousy, especially when Joseph shared 2 dreams that he had. In the first dream, Joseph and his brothers were binding sheaves of grain in the field when suddenly Joseph's sheaf rose and stood upright, while the sheaves of his brothers gathered around and bowed down to it, Genesis 37:7. In the second dream, the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to Joseph, Genesis 37:9. These dreams suggested that Joseph would one day rule over his family, and this fueled his brothers' bitterness even further. Hostility towards Joseph reached its peak when his brothers plotted to kill him in the wilderness. The brothers saw an opportunity to act on their resentment when Joseph was sent by Jacob to check on them while they were tending their flocks near Dothan. When they saw him approaching, their jealousy boiled over into hatred, and they conspired to kill him. Reuben, the eldest brother, intervened, suggesting they throw Joseph into a cistern instead of shedding his blood, hoping to rescue him later, Genesis 37:21-22. However, while Reuben was away, Judah suggested that they sell Joseph to a group of passing Ishmaelite traders rather than kill him. The brothers agreed, and Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, marking the beginning of his life as a slave in Egypt, Genesis 37:28. The brothers dipped Joseph's coat in the blood of a slaughtered goat and took it to Jacob, leading him to believe that a wild animal had killed his beloved son. Jacob was inconsolable, grieving deeply for Joseph and refusing to be comforted, Genesis 37:33-35. Meanwhile, Joseph was taken to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. The betrayal by his brothers could have left Joseph broken and bitter. He was ripped from his home, his family, and his status as the favored son, sold into a foreign land where he had no rights or privileges. However, as the story unfolds, Joseph's life takes unexpected turns that demonstrate God's sovereign hand over his destiny, even in the midst of immense suffering. Joseph's time in slavery, while beginning with injustice, sets the stage for his eventual rise to power in Egypt. His ability to endure such hardship with faith and integrity showcases his unshakable trust in God's plan, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Despite the hatred and betrayal of his brothers, Joseph's story becomes a powerful testimony to God's ability to transform the worst of situations into something profoundly good. Joseph the prisoner with a gift for magical dream interpretation. Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt and purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the Commodore, Genesis 39:1. Despite his grim circumstances, Joseph quickly rose to a position of trust within Potiphar's household because the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Genesis 39:2. Potiphar recognized Joseph's abilities and made him overseer of his household and all that he owned. Potiphar's house prospered under Joseph's stewardship, and it seemed that Joseph was beginning to find some stability. However, this period of prosperity was cut short by a dramatic and unjust event. Potiphar's wife became infatuated with Joseph due to his handsome appearance and repeatedly attempted to seduce him. Genesis 39:7. Joseph, however, remained resolute in his commitment to God and his master. He rejected her advances, stating, "How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Genesis 39:9. Joseph's response highlights his deep integrity and loyalty, even in the face of persistent temptation. But Potiphar's wife did not take rejection kindly. One day, when the two were alone in the house, she grabbed Joseph's garment and demanded that he lie with her. Joseph fled the scene, leaving his garment in her hands. In her anger and humiliation, Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of trying to assault her. When Potiphar heard his wife's fabricated story, he had Joseph thrown into prison. Genesis 39:19-20. Despite his innocence, Joseph now found himself in an Egyptian dungeon, his life once again shattered by betrayal and injustice. While Joseph was imprisoned, the Bible tells us that the Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39:21. Despite the darkness of his circumstances, Joseph continued to prosper because of his steadfast faith and trust in God. His ability to maintain his spiritual focus, even in prison, is a testament to his resilience and deep relationship with the Lord. Joseph's gift for dream interpretation first came to light during this time. Two of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker, were thrown into prison with Joseph. One night, each of them had a troubling dream, and they were deeply disturbed because they had no one to interpret their dreams. Upon noticing their distress, Joseph asked them about their dreams and confidently stated, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." Genesis 48. Joseph's words reveal his complete dependence on God for the ability to interpret dreams. He did not claim any personal credit for his gift, but instead acknowledged that it was God who provided the insight. The cupbearer shared his dream first. In the dream, he saw a vine with 3 branches which budded and produced grapes. The cupbearer pressed the grapes into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph explained that the 3 branches represented 3 days, and within those 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. Genesis 49:13. Encouraged by the positive interpretation, the baker also shared his dream. In his dream, he carried 3 baskets of bread on his head, but birds were eating the bread from the top basket. Joseph interpreted the dream to mean that within 3 days, the baker would be executed, and birds would eat his flesh. Genesis 40:16-19. Both interpretations came true precisely as Joseph had foretold. 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, the cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed. Genesis 40:20-22. Despite this remarkable display of divine insight, Joseph was not immediately released from prison. He had asked the cupbearer to remember him and mention him to Pharaoh, but the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. Genesis 40:23. Joseph remained in prison for another 2 years, but his faith did not waver. Even in the darkness of the dungeon, Joseph trusted God's timing and plan. The ability to interpret dreams in the ancient world was often seen as a divine gift, and in Joseph's case, it was directly tied to his relationship with God. Joseph never took credit for his gift, consistently pointing to God as the true source of his insight. His interpretation of dreams was not mere guesswork or superstition, but a reflection of the divine wisdom granted to him by God. In ancient cultures, dreams were often believed to be messages from the gods or the divine realm. The Bible reflects this belief in various instances where dreams play a pivotal role in guiding people's actions or revealing future events. Joseph's dreams earlier in life, where his brother sheaves bowed to his and the sun, moon, and stars bowed down to him, were prophetic visions that foreshadowed his eventual rise to power in Egypt and the reconciliation with his family. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams was not only a spiritual gift, but also a form of divine communication. God used Joseph as a vessel to reveal hidden truths and to guide the events of history. This gift ultimately positioned Joseph for his rise to power and influence in Pharaoh's court. After 2 years of waiting, Pharaoh himself had a series of troubling dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret. It was only then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph and recommended him to Pharaoh. Genesis 41:9-13. Pharaoh summoned Joseph from the prison and recounted his dreams, one in which 7 fat cows were devoured by 7 thin cows, and another in which 7 healthy ears of grain were swallowed up by 7 thin, withered ears of grain. Joseph explained that both dreams were the same, revealing that Egypt would experience 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of severe famine. Joseph then offered Pharaoh advice on how to prepare for the coming famine by storing up surplus grain during the years of plenty. Genesis 41:25-36. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom and recognizing the divine favor upon him, Pharaoh appointed Joseph as second in command over all of Egypt. Joseph went from being a slave and prisoner to becoming one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. This extraordinary rise from the lowest of positions to the heights of power was a direct result of Joseph's unwavering faith in God and his reliance on the divine gift of dream interpretation. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams was a reflection of his intimate relationship with God. Throughout his life, Joseph demonstrated an unshakable faith, even in the face of betrayal, false accusations, and imprisonment. His trust in God's plan for his life enabled him to endure hardship without losing hope. Each time Joseph used his gift of interpretation, he acknowledged that it was not his ability but God working through him. The fact that Joseph attributed his success to God, rather than to his skill or intellect, further highlights the depth of his relationship with the divine. Joseph's humility and recognition of God's sovereignty were key elements in his character. In many ways, Joseph's life serves as a model of how faithfulness to God can lead to unexpected and extraordinary outcomes, even in the most challenging circumstances. Joseph from prisoner to Egypt's most powerful vizier. In jail, Joseph was again blessed by God. Genesis 39:21-23. Joseph interpreted the dreams of 2 of his fellow prisoners. While Joseph was in prison, 2 of Pharaoh's officials, the cupbearer and the baker, were thrown into the same prison. Both men had dreams that troubled them, and they were unable to understand their meanings. Joseph, noticing their distress, asked them to share their dreams, declaring, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." Genesis 48. The cupbearer shared his dream with Joseph first. In the dream, the cupbearer saw a vine with 3 branches. The branches budded, blossomed, and produced clusters of ripe grapes, which the cupbearer squeezed into Pharaoh's cup and placed in his hand. Genesis 49:11. Joseph, with divine insight, interpreted the dream, revealing that within 3 days, the cupbearer would be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. Genesis 40:12-13. Joseph also asked the cupbearer to remember him when he returned to Pharaoh's service, hoping that the cupbearer could help secure his release from prison. Genesis 40:14. The baker, encouraged by the favorable interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, shared his own. In his dream, the baker had 3 baskets of bread on his head, and the birds were eating the bread from the top basket. Genesis 40:16-17. Unfortunately, Joseph had to deliver the devastating interpretation within 3 days. The baker would be executed, and the birds would eat his flesh. Genesis 40:18-19. Both interpretations proved accurate, as the cupbearer was restored to his position, and the baker was executed, just as Joseph had said. Genesis 40:20-22. Despite Joseph's accurate interpretations and his request for help, the cupbearer forgot about him, and Joseph remained in prison for another 2 years. Genesis 40:23. However, Joseph's ability to interpret dreams would soon lead to a remarkable transformation in his life, as God's plan for him continued to unfold. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had 2 disturbing dreams that none of his magicians or wise men could interpret. In the first dream, Pharaoh saw 7 healthy, fat cows come up out of the Nile River, followed by 7 gaunt, thin cows. The thin cows devoured the healthy ones but remained as emaciated as before. Genesis 41:1-4. In the second dream, Pharaoh saw 7 full, healthy ears of grain on a single stalk, followed by 7 thin, scorched ears of grain. The thin ears swallowed up the healthy ones. Genesis 41:5-7. Pharaoh was deeply troubled by these dreams and sought explanations, but no one in his court could interpret them. It was then that the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about the Hebrew prisoner who had accurately interpreted his dream 2 years earlier. Genesis 41:9-13. Pharaoh immediately summoned Joseph from the prison, and Joseph was quickly brought before him. Genesis 41:14. When Pharaoh asked Joseph to interpret his dreams, Joseph humbly replied, "I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." Genesis 41:16. Joseph's statement highlighted his reliance on God for wisdom and insight, reinforcing the theme of divine guidance throughout his life. Joseph listened to Pharaoh recount his dreams, and with God's help, he provided the interpretation. Joseph explained that both dreams were the same God was revealing to Pharaoh what was about to happen in Egypt. The 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy ears of grain represented 7 years of abundance, while the 7 gaunt cows and 7 scorched ears of grain represented 7 years of severe famine that would follow Genesis 41:25-27. Joseph warned Pharaoh that the famine would be so severe that the years of plenty would be forgotten, Genesis 41:30-31. In addition to interpreting the dreams, Joseph offered Pharaoh a plan to save Egypt from the coming disaster. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the collection of surplus grain during the 7 years of abundance, which could then be stored for use during the 7 years of famine, Genesis 41:33-36. Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph's wisdom and insight that he immediately appointed him to this position. Pharaoh declared, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God," Genesis 41:38. He then placed Joseph in charge of the entire land of Egypt, saying, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you," Genesis 41:40. Joseph was given Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen garments, and a gold chain, symbols of his authority and power, Genesis 41:42. Joseph's promotion to vizier of Egypt marked a dramatic transformation in his life. From being a prisoner in a dungeon, he was now the second most powerful man in the land, overseeing all of Egypt's resources and people. Joseph's authority was absolute, as Pharaoh had entrusted him with the critical task of saving the nation from famine. Pharaoh told Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all concerning 41:44. As a vizier, Joseph was not only granted immense political power but also great wealth. He rode in a chariot as Pharaoh's second in command, and people bowed down before him, acknowledging his authority, Genesis 41:43. Joseph was also given an Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, and was married to Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, a priest of On, Genesis 41:45. This marriage further integrated Joseph into the Egyptian elite, and he became part of the most powerful and influential circles in the country. Joseph's power and wealth were used wisely as he began to implement his plan to prepare Egypt for the coming famine. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph oversaw the collection and storage of vast quantities of grain. The Bible notes that he stored up so much grain that it was like the sand of the sea and beyond measure, Genesis 41:49. Joseph's leadership during this time ensured that Egypt would not only survive the famine but also thrive while other nations suffered. When the 7 years of abundance came to an end, the predicted famine began to spread throughout Egypt and the surrounding lands. Because of Joseph's foresight and leadership, Egypt was well prepared. As the famine worsened, people from all over Egypt and other nations came to Joseph to buy grain, Genesis 41:56-57. Joseph's management of the grain supplies not only saved Egypt but also positioned the nation as a regional power, with neighboring countries depending on its resources for survival. The famine eventually brought Joseph's own family to Egypt. His brothers, who had sold him into slavery years earlier, came seeking food, unaware that the powerful vizier they now stood before was their brother. Joseph recognized them, but they did not recognize him. Through a series of tests, Joseph sought to discern whether his brothers had changed and whether they felt remorse for their past actions. Finally, Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers in a moment of emotional reconciliation. His brothers were terrified, fearing that Joseph would seek revenge for their betrayal. However, Joseph reassured them, saying, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life," Genesis 45:5. Joseph's forgiveness and understanding of God's plan were remarkable. He saw his suffering and hardships as part of God's larger purpose to save his family and preserve the future nation of Israel. Joseph's rise from prisoner to vizier is a powerful testament to how God can transform a person's life, even in the most unlikely circumstances. His story highlights themes of faith, perseverance, and divine providence, showing that God's plans are often beyond human understanding but are always for a greater good. As a vizier, Joseph not only saved Egypt from famine, but also played a crucial role in the survival of his own family, the future Israelites. His leadership, wisdom, and reliance on God allowed him to navigate the challenges he faced and to use his position of power for the benefit of others. Joseph's legacy as vizier is one of humility and faithfulness. Despite his immense power and wealth, Joseph remained humble and continually acknowledged that his abilities came from God. His life serves as a reminder that true success and greatness come not from worldly achievements but from a deep relationship with God and a willingness to follow his plan, no matter the challenges. Joseph's forgiveness and glory for the Israelites in Egypt. Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers after the immense suffering they had caused him is one of the most remarkable acts of forgiveness in the Bible. Years after selling Joseph into slavery, his brothers, driven by the famine, came to Egypt seeking food, unaware that the brother they betrayed had become the vizier of Egypt. Joseph recognized them immediately, but instead of revealing his identity, he tested them to see if they had changed. He wanted to know if they regretted their actions and if their hearts had softened over the years. Joseph's tests, though difficult for his brothers, revealed the transformation in their hearts. He accused them of being spies, imprisoned one of them, and demanded that they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, back to Egypt. Joseph's brothers feared God's judgment for what they had done to Joseph years earlier, and their distress showed their remorse. Genesis 42:21-22. When they finally returned with Benjamin, Joseph tested them once more, planting a silver cup in Benjamin's sack and accusing him of theft. Judah, who had initially suggested selling Joseph into slavery, offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin, demonstrating his willingness to sacrifice for his brother. Genesis 44:33-34. This act of selflessness moved Joseph deeply, and he could no longer contain his emotions. He revealed his true identity to his brothers in a moment of intense emotion, weeping so loudly that even the Egyptians heard him. Genesis 45:1-2. His brothers were terrified, fearing that Joseph would take revenge for their betrayal. However, Joseph's response was one of grace and forgiveness. He reassured them, saying, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." Genesis 45:5. Joseph's forgiveness was not merely an act of mercy, it was also an acknowledgement of God's greater plan. Joseph recognized that his suffering had been part of a divine purpose to save his family and many others from the famine. He explained to his brothers that it was God who had sent him to Egypt, not them, and that God had used their actions to bring about the preservation of their entire family. Genesis 45:7-8. This perspective allowed Joseph to forgive with a heart full of love, recognizing that his suffering had been turned into a blessing for all of them. After revealing himself to his brothers, Joseph was eager to be reunited with his father, Jacob, who had believed for years that Joseph was dead. Joseph instructed his brothers to return to Canaan and bring their father and the entire family to Egypt, where Joseph could provide for them during the remaining years of the famine. Genesis 45:9-11. Pharaoh, upon hearing about Joseph's family, offered them the best land in Egypt, the land of Goshen, for them to settle and live in peace and abundance. Genesis 45:17-18. When Joseph's brothers returned to Canaan and told their father that Joseph was alive and ruling over Egypt, Jacob was initially in disbelief. But when he saw the wagons and provisions that Joseph had sent, his spirit was revived, and he exclaimed, "It is enough, Joseph, my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Genesis 45:28. The reunion between Joseph and Jacob is one of the most touching moments in the Bible. When they finally met in Egypt, Joseph embraced his father and wept for a long time. Genesis 46:29. Jacob, overwhelmed with joy, expressed his contentment, saying, "Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive." Genesis 46:30. This moment of reconciliation brought healing and peace to Jacob's heart after years of grief and loss. Joseph's position as the vizier of Egypt afforded him immense wealth, power, and glory. As the second most powerful man in Egypt, he had control over the nation's resources and commanded great respect from the Egyptian people. Pharaoh had given Joseph authority over all the land, and Joseph wielded this power with wisdom and grace. His marriage to Asenath, the daughter of a high-ranking priest, further cemented his place within the Egyptian elite. Joseph's wealth was vast as he had access to the riches of Egypt, and his power was unrivaled, save for Pharaoh himself. Despite his wealth and power, Joseph never forgot his roots or his responsibility to his family. When Jacob and his family arrived in Egypt, Joseph ensured that they were well taken care of. Pharaoh had offered them the best land in Goshen, an area well suited for their livestock and their needs. Genesis 47:6. Joseph personally saw to it that his family was provided for, demonstrating his deep love and commitment to them. Under Joseph's protection, the Israelites prospered in Egypt, and their numbers grew significantly during the years they lived there. Joseph's actions towards his family reflect the values of forgiveness, love, and compassion that he held dear. Even though his brothers had wronged him in the past, Joseph welcomed them with open arms and provided for their every need. His forgiveness was not just a one-time act, but a continual demonstration of love and care for his family. Joseph's actions in bringing his family to Egypt and providing for them during the famine had far-reaching implications for the future of the Israelite people. His leadership and protection ensured that the Israelites would survive the famine and that they would flourish in a foreign land. Under Joseph's care, the Israelites were not only spared from the hardships of the famine, but were also allowed to thrive in Egypt's fertile land. The Bible records that the Israelites became fruitful and multiplied greatly during their time in Egypt, Genesis 47:27. This period of prosperity laid the foundation for the future growth of the nation of Israel, even though it would eventually lead to their enslavement by a later Pharaoh who did not remember Joseph's contributions, Exodus 1:8-14. Nevertheless, Joseph's actions during this time were instrumental in preserving the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which would ultimately lead to the birth of the nation of Israel and the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. Joseph's role as a protector and provider for his family reflects his deep sense of responsibility and love for them. Despite the wrongs that had been done to him, Joseph saw the bigger picture and understood that God had placed him in a position of power for a purpose. His forgiveness and care for his family ensured their survival and the continuation of God's covenant with his ancestors. The story of Joseph's forgiveness and reconciliation with his family is one of the most powerful examples of love and redemption in the Bible. Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers, despite the immense suffering they had caused him, is a testament to his strong faith and his understanding of God's sovereignty. Joseph did not allow bitterness or anger to take root in his heart. Instead, he chose to act with grace and compassion, recognizing that God had used even the darkest moments of his life for a greater purpose. Joseph's love for his family extended beyond forgiveness. He not only forgave them but also took on the role of their protector and provider. His actions ensured that the Israelites would survive the famine and flourish in Egypt, setting the stage for the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. Joseph's legacy is one of love, forgiveness, and faithfulness to God's plan, even in the face of hardship and betrayal. His story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of family, the strength of forgiveness, and how God can use even the most painful experiences for good. Joseph's life was a journey of suffering and triumph, and through it all, he remained steadfast in his faith, trusting that God was with him every step of the way. His love for his family and his unwavering commitment to God's plan continue to inspire believers today, reminding them of the transformative power of forgiveness and the enduring strength of love. What are the meanings of Joseph's story? One of the central themes of Joseph's story is God's sovereign hand at work behind the scenes. Though Joseph endured great suffering, betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment, God used these events to bring about his divine Joseph's rise to power in Egypt, and his eventual reconciliation with his family reveal that God can use even the most difficult circumstances for his purposes. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today, Genesis 50:20. This statement by Joseph highlights his recognition that God was in control throughout his life, and it speaks to the idea that God's plans often surpass human understanding. Joseph's forgiveness of his brothers is one of the most powerful aspects of his story. After being betrayed and sold into slavery by his own flesh and blood, Joseph had every reason to hold a grudge. However, he chose forgiveness and reconciliation instead of revenge. Joseph's forgiveness is a model for believers, showing that genuine forgiveness is possible, even in the face of deep hurt. The story emphasizes that forgiveness does not only benefit the one being forgiven, but also frees the person offering forgiveness from bitterness and resentment. Joseph's act of grace towards his brothers helped restore the broken family and ensured the preservation of the Israelites. Joseph's story demonstrates how faithfulness in adversity is rewarded by God. Despite the numerous hardships Joseph endured, from being sold into slavery to being falsely accused and imprisoned, he remained steadfast in his faith in God. Joseph's integrity and refusal to compromise, especially in the face of temptation from Potiphar's wife, Genesis 39:7-20, show his unwavering commitment to righteousness. His faithfulness in difficult circumstances eventually led to his elevation to a position of immense power and responsibility in Egypt. Joseph's story reminds believers that while trials are inevitable, remaining faithful to God will ultimately result in blessings and spiritual growth. dreams play a significant role in the life of Joseph, from his dreams as a young man to his ability to interpret the dreams of others. Joseph's God-given gift of interpreting dreams led to his rise to prominence in Egypt and ultimately saved countless lives during the famine. The story highlights that God can communicate through dreams and that such divine revelations often carry significant meaning. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams was not merely a natural talent but a gift from God that allowed him to discern his will and plans for the future. Joseph's life is a testament to the importance of perseverance and patience. His journey from being sold into slavery to becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt took years, during which Joseph had to endure immense suffering and uncertainty. Despite the long wait, Joseph never lost faith in God's plan for his life. He remained patient, trusting that God would fulfill his promises in his own time. The story teaches that believers must often wait on God's timing and trust that he is working for their good, even when they cannot see immediate results. The story of Joseph also carries a theme of redemption and restoration. Despite the pain caused by his brother's betrayal, Joseph's position of power in Egypt allowed him to be the instrument of salvation for his family. This not only resulted in the survival of the Israelites during the famine, but also paved the way for the eventual formation of the nation of Israel. Joseph's life is a precursor to the ultimate story of redemption found in Jesus Christ. Just as Joseph was rejected, suffered, and rose to a position of power to save others, so too did Christ suffer, die, and rise again to save humanity. Joseph's life can be seen as a foreshadowing of the redemptive work of Christ. Another significant aspect of Joseph's story is the theme of family reconciliation and the enduring power of love. Joseph's love for his family was evident in his actions, especially in his willingness to forgive them and provide for them during the famine. His decision to care for his brothers and father, despite their past betrayal, highlights the importance of maintaining family bonds and choosing love over hatred. The restoration of Joseph's family also points to the healing P of God. Despite years of division, hurt, and brokenness, God orchestrated events to bring Joseph and his family back together, restoring their relationships and allowing them to live in harmony once again. Joseph's story is also a powerful reminder of God's provision. Despite the years of hardship, God was with Joseph every step of the way, providing for his needs and guiding him through difficult times. From being favored by Potiphar to being entrusted with the care of Egypt's grain stores during the famine, Joseph experienced God's provision in both physical and spiritual ways. Joseph's success in Egypt was not due to his own abilities alone, but to God's hand upon him. The story emphasizes that God provides for his people, even in times of great trial and uncertainty. Just as God provided for Joseph and his family during the famine, he continues to provide for believers today. In Christian tradition, Joseph is often seen as a type of Christ, a person whose life foreshadows the life and work of Jesus. Like Jesus, Joseph was betrayed by his people, suffered unjustly, and ultimately rose to a position of authority to bring salvation to others. Both Joseph and Jesus were instruments of God's redemptive plan, and both displayed remarkable love, forgiveness, and faithfulness in the face of adversity. Joseph's life points to the greater story of redemption that would be fulfilled in Christ. His willingness to forgive his brothers, his role in saving his family, and his faith in God's plan all mirror the life and work of Jesus. Finally, the story of Joseph is a story of hope. Despite facing overwhelming challenges, Joseph's faith in God never wavered. His story teaches that no matter how dire the circumstances, God is always at work, bringing about his purposes and offering hope to those who trust in him. Joseph's rise from the pit of slavery to the palace of Pharaoh is a testament to the power of hope and faith in God's ability to turn even the darkest situations into moments of triumph and blessing. Joseph's journey from favored son to rejected slave and ultimately to Egypt's most powerful ruler demonstrates that God's plans are far greater than anything we can imagine. His ability to forgive his brothers, interpret dreams with divine insight, and rise above adversity highlights the transformative power of faith, perseverance, and trust in God's providence. Joseph's life is a powerful reminder that no matter how difficult our circumstances may seem, God is always working behind the scenes for our good and his glory. If you found inspiration in Joseph's story and want to dive deeper into more biblical narratives like this, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more faith-based content that enriches your spiritual journey. And remember, by sharing this video, you're helping spread God's message to more people. Thanks for watching, and God bless.